Hello, everyone, and welcome to EMAN, Effectively Making a Noise. My name is Cheryl Secrest, and I am your host today. Today's episode is going to be very sensitive to me, and even before I started recording this morning, I had tears just coming to my eyes because today I am going to be talking about feeding tubes, the misconceptions of feeding tubes. All this stems from a case back in 2005 from the Terri Schiavo. She had collapsed in 1990 and of cardiac arrest. She lost a lot of oxygen during that time to her brain. She was revived, but she was said to be in a persistent vegetative state. The reason for her collapse was because she was dieting and was basically drinking liquids all day, which again, too much liquids can also cause problems and could cause death. So Terri Schiavo went on hospice, and this was in 1990. Well, in 2005, uh, she passed away, but she passed away from dehydration. And this is where my problem comes in with this case, because the reason why she passed away from dehydration was because they disconnected her feeding tube. Now, at the beginning of her collapse, yes, she was ventilated and she was on a vent, but eventually she was taken off that vent. A feeding tube was placed in her stomach to feed her nutrition. It was not breathing for her or even giving her oxygen. It was simply giving her the nutrition that she needed to get back on her feet. Now, true enough, she probably would have never come out of the full brain damage, but from the things that I saw on the live television scenes where her mother was talking to her, she was actually looking at her mother and smiling. That to me says that there was some brain function there. And the reason I can elaborate and talk on this is because in 1996, I had my son who uh, cut his own oxygen off to his brain because he sat on his own tube. And before he was born, he was breached, and he sat on his own tube and cut his oxygen off to his brain. Well, they told me that he was going to be in a vegetative state, that he wouldn't recognize us, he wouldn't be able to walk, talk, eat, or do anything else. Well, he wasn't able to walk, he wasn't able to talk, but he was being fed by a feeding tube, and simply because when he lost that oxygen to his brain, it cut off. There was a mid-brain stem dysfunction in his case, and it actually prevented him from getting the suck and swallow reflex, which would allow him to drink out of a bottle and eat and swallow food. He couldn't do that. Now later on, he started swallowing, but he still didn't have that suck reflex. And that's what I want to talk about today, because there's a lot of us that's going to have to make decisions on whether to put their loved one, put a feeding tube in their loved one to keep the nutrition going, because there are a whole lot of ways and things that would prevent them from eating. And I'm going to say some of those. But the thing was that Terri Schiavo, if you haven't heard of it, if you wasn't around during that time, please look it up and read about it. Because at one point, they actually said that she had orally, now this is what I'm saying, orally mumbled that she wanted the feeding tube removed. And that's why I have a problem, because if she was in a persistent vegetative state, if her brain was damaged that much, she wouldn't have been able to orally say anything. They told me that my son was going to just sit there and stare up at the ceiling. Well, that was far from what he did in his life. He proved every doctor wrong. Now, I know doctors, they have to tell you these things, because if they don't and something doesn't happen, then they've got a lawsuit on their hand. So I understand that. But it's up to the family, after being told that they're not going to be able to do anything. then you come into effect. You get the necessary resources to help that person get back to a normal state or a somewhat normal state. With us, we kept him stimulated. We kept moving him around. We got in his face, and he could see us, and he did recognize us. But if you don't have that support system and your resources, and you just let a person lay there, then no, they're not going to do anything. But in her case, I believe if they had to work with her, she would have come out of some of that vegetative state, because she did look at her mother and kind of smile. But that's where I want to introduce it to, because today I'm going to give you some myths and some facts about the feeding tube, because a lot of people, they had a misconception about the feeding tube when all this was going on. They made it sound like that feeding tube was keeping her alive. Yes, it was keeping nutrition going, but it was not the oxygen that was needed to keep her alive. It was not a vent. They did the autopsy on her. Her heart was healthy. Well, that goes to show you that the feeding tube was just feeding her, and they disconnected it, and she died. She sit there and starved. They starved her to death, because an autopsy showed that she passed away from dehydration, which meant that she wasn't getting any liquids or anything, food or water, in her system. So she was basically starved to death. And that's what hurts me so bad, is the misconceptions that people get from that case, because a lot of people were saying, well, that feeding tube is keeping her alive. No, it wasn't. It was giving her the nutrition to keep her alive. It was not her oxygen. It was not her anything that was artificially keeping her alive. She was healthy. Her heart was healthy. She just didn't have her brain working correctly. And like I said, had the resources been taken, had the things been taken, the actions been taken to help her, to stimulate her, then I believe she would have still been here today with us, or she might not been here today, but she would have been a little bit better off than she was when she passed away. So today, I'm just going to go through here and let you know what a feeding tube is, what it is, and what it means to have a feeding tube. So first, a feeding tube is a medical device used to provide nutrition to people who cannot obtain nutrition by mouth, are unable to swallow safely, or need nutritional supplementation. The state of being fed by a feeding tube is called gravage, internal feeding, or tube feeding. Placement may be temporary for the treatment of acute conditions, or lifelong in the case of chronic disabilities. A variety of feeding tubes are used in medical practice. They are usually made of polyurethane or silicone. The diameter of a feeding tube is measured in French units. Each unit equals 1/3 millimeter. They are classified by the site of insertion and intended use. So this here is something that just gives nutrition. You can actually hold the tube with a you can bolus, which is what we did with our son. You can have it hooked up to a feeding machine, which automatically gives the certain amount of nutrition at certain times. You can do all that, but it's only to feed that person. It is not pumping oxygen into their lungs or artificially keeping them alive. Now, that right there, I want to make sure. So the next thing is, why a feeding tube? And these are the medical uses. It says there are dozens of conditions that may require feeding tube. The more common conditions that necessitate feeding tubes include prematurity, which is a premature baby who cannot suck and swallow real good at that time, failure to thrive, or malnutrition, which is what happened to my son, because he was getting fed, but he wasn't getting bigger. He wasn't growing. So he had a tube before he left the hospital. So he had a feeding tube the 20 years of his life. Neurological or neuromuscular disorders. inability to swallow. He also didn't have the swallow reflex. Anatomical and post-surgical malformations of the mouth and esophagus, cancer, Sanfilippo syndrome, and digestive disorders. And these are the uses of a feeding tube. The reason why you would use a feeding tube. Now, in children, we're going to break it down. In children, feeding tubes are used widely in children with excellent success for a wide variety of conditions. Some children use them temporarily until they are able to eat on their own, while other children require long term. Some children only use feeding tubes to supplement their oral diet, while others rely on them excessively. And that means that the feeding tubes are not forever. You can use them just for a little while until you get yourself ready to be able to eat by mouth. So they're not forever, they're not permanent. In a dementia patient, it says people with advanced dementia who get feeding assistance rather than feeding tubes have better outcomes. Feeding tubes do not increase life expectancy for such people or protect them from aspiration pneumonia. And aspiration pneumonia, that's very important because with a feeding tube, you usually have to have the person at a 90-degree angle so that the feeding will go down the tube and into their stomach and not come back up and get into their lungs. Now, that is something that you have to watch when you have a feeding tube. It says feeding tubes can also increase the risk of pressure ulcers, require pharmaceutical or physical restraints, and lead to distress. In the final stages of dementia, assisted feeding may still be preferred over a feeding tube to bring benefits of palliative care and human interaction even when nutritional goals are not being met. And this is for the hospice patients. So some people might determine that they, want to just continue to feed by mouth instead of having a feeding tube. But you do not connect your nutrition away. They did not give her anything to drink or to eat by mouth or otherwise. ICU patients. Feeding tubes are often used in the intensive care unit, ICU, to provide nutrition to people who are critically ill while their medical conditions are addressed. As of 2016, there was no consensus as to whether nasogastric or gastric tubes led to better outcomes. Medical obstruction and dysmotility. There is at least moderate evidence for feeding tubes improving outcomes of chronic malnutrition in people with cancers of the head and neck that obstruct the esophagus and would limit oral intake. People with advanced gastroparesis and ALS. For long-term use, gastric tubes appear to have better outcomes than nasogastric tubes. This is for people who can't swallow. Again, this is for someone who is unable to swallow, maybe due to throat cancer or something like that, but it is not pumping oxygen in the lungs. GI surgery. People who have surgery on their throat or stomach often have a feeding tube while recovering from surgery. A tube leading through the nose and down to the middle part of the small intestine is used, or a tube is directly placed through the abdomen to the small intestine. As of 2017, it appeared that people with a tube through the nose were able to start eating normally sooner. So my son first had the tube in the nose, but we decided to go ahead and put a tube in his stomach because we knew if he did get to moving around, then we'd have to keep putting that tube in his nose. I did not want to do that. So we ended up having a Mickey button, which is what it's called, placed in his stomach so that we wouldn't have to worry about trying to put that tube in and out of his nose. So that's some reasons why you would consider a feeding tube for an individual because of the medical uses that it could help. It could make sure that that person is actually getting the nutrition that they need while they are recovering from the injury or the trauma. It does not put air in the lungs. I'm gonna keep repeating that. So, benefits of a feeding tubes. We have the pros and the cons, and I'm going to tell you both because it's important that you know the good benefits and the bad benefits. But let me let you know this is not because it is putting air in the lungs. Why feeding tubes may be a good decision. Under the right circumstances, a feeding tube can considerably improve the person's quality of life. They can relieve gas, bloating, nausea, and vomiting. But the main goal of a feeding tube is to make sure food or liquid does not make its way to the lungs, resulting in aspiration pneumonia. A feeding tube is also easily removed by a family of the care team if need be, in a matter of seconds. So you can take it out, and if you don't have something to place in that hole, it will close up and you will have to have surgery to reopen it to put that tube back. So when you remove it, you have to do quickly whatever you're doing or it will close up on you. Today's dietitian says that nutrition support via feeding tube for hospice patients reduces physical deterioration, improves quality of life, and prevents the emotional effect of starving the person to death. Let me read that again. It prevents the emotional effect of starving the person to death. Something families really struggle with. And like I said, after this Terri Schiavo case, people needed to think about if they were agreeing that it should be taken out, they need to think about what they're agreeing to because they agreed to starving a person to death. Next, we're going to have why feeding tubes may not be a good decision. It says there are side effects of inserting a central catheter, mainly its ability to cause infection, sepsis, vein clots, collapsed lungs, cardiac arrhythmias, and electrolyte disturbances, which are all life-threatening. NG tubes may lead to choking and discomfort, which is the one that goes down the nose, and when not inserted into the trachea properly, pneumonia can result. Such tubes have been known to cause erosions and abrasions within the nasal passages, stomach, and esophagus, which can cause bleeding. Sometimes patients dislike the tube so much they try to yank it out, which in my case, my son yanked it out his stomach, and it freaked me out, but I read the instructions that came with it, and I got it reinserted, and we were fine. Not to mention injury. According to Healthline, NG tubes can also get blocked, dislodged, or torn, leading to the formation of ulcers or infections of the throat, sinuses, esophagus, or stomach. Now, in my case, my son had a Mickey button, and what you do, you put water in it's a balloon, and you insert it into his stomach, into the little hole. You pump water in it, and it makes it a balloon up under the surface of his stomach, and that keeps it connected and keeps it close to the stomach. Then you would insert the tube on the little button, twist it closed, and then we bolus fed him. And sometimes, like I said, we had the feeding machine, which you can time it to however many minutes that you want the food to go into the stomach, and you don't have to worry about stopping and feeding him. But we bolus fed him. So yeah, you have to make sure you know how to clean it. You have to make sure you know how to take care of it. And before we left the hospital that he was born in, we were instructed and shown how to take care of the feeding tube, how to use it correctly, how to, if something happened, how to contact someone. Because it was one time where the balloon busted, we had to call the medical supply company. They had to bring us a new one. In the meantime, I stuck the tube that was busted, I put it back in his stomach to keep the hole from closing, because it will close up. And now the age, that a person can have a tube, like I said, and a premature baby. That's premature when they first born. You can have it from there on up to you 90, 98, 99. But just remember, it is for nutritional purposes. It is not keeping air going to your lungs or to your brains. It is keeping you fed. Simply keeping you fed. So now there are some myths and facts about feeding tubes. I just want to give y'all a little bit of those just to have you guys thinking, because this is such a sensitive and a I mean it's means so much to me for people to know the real deal about feeding tubes, not what they hear, the negative things, the misconceptions. I want you guys to know the real deal. And I lived it for 20 years. My son passed away in 2016, but he had a feeding tube for 20 years. He was fine with it. It never bothered him. It didn't keep him from moving around, turning over, sliding on the floor. It didn't keep him from doing any of that. So, myths and facts. Myth: tube feeding is forever. Myth: you have to get everything right away. Myth: a child's physical activity will be limited by having a feeding tube. Myth: you will need a nurse to care for your child if you tube feed at home. Myth: you must use formula for tube feeding. So the first myth says you didn't try hard enough to make your child eat. Well, if that child's brain is not telling them to eat, or if they don't have that swallow and that suck reflex, then there's no way. The fact, in our experience, parents try everything to get their children to eat. It is a natural instinct for a parent to feed his or her child. Some children require extra nutritional support to stay healthy. Tube feeding is a last resort. Tube feeding allows children to get the nutritional support they need to grow and develop, either when eating orally or not possible, or while exploring the medical reasons a child cannot eat and drink enough. Myth: you can't eat by mouth when you have a feeding tube. Fact: some children benefit from tube feeding because they can't eat enough by mouth. Others need tubes because they can't eat some or all types of food safely. If your child can eat safely by mouth, oral eating should be encouraged as much as possible to maintain and develop oral eating skills. Myth: tube feeding is forever. Fact: some children have medical conditions that will require them to have tube feeds their whole lives. But for many children, tube feeding is temporarily. Children are able to wean off their feeding tubes once they are no longer medically necessary. It is often difficult to estimate how long a tube feeding will be needed, especially if the child's medical condition is not fully understood. Myth: you have to get everything right away. Fact: just like everything in parenting, you will make mistakes and learn from them. Don't panic when you do. We all have made mistakes. There can be a bit of trial and error in the beginning. Tube feeding isn't one size fits all. Learning what is best for your child is a step by step process, particularly with infants and children who are unable to tell us what they are feeling. And this goes for adults as well who get older, have dementia. We need to know understand what tube needs to be used and how to use it. Myth: a child's physical activity will be limited by having a feeding tube. Fact: tube feeding itself does not limit a child's ability to roll around, play, climb, run, swim, or play sports. A child's physical ability would not be impacted by having a feeding tube. Even children who feed continuously can wear feeding pumps and backpacks and still be active. So if your child has to have a feeding tube, they can still participate in any and everything the other children doing. Myth: you would need a nurse to care for your child if you tube feed at home. Fact: It is easy for parents and caregivers to learn how to use the feeding tube safely at home. Very few parents have any medical background before they begin the feeding tube journey, and that was for me. I had no clue about feeding tubes until my son was born and couldn't suck and swallow, and we had to learn it. Matter of fact, the kit that the feeding tube comes in has an instruction book with it. So you don't even have to call anybody. You can read that instruction book to figure out how to do this. Myth: you must use formula for feeding tubes. Fact: you can tube feed breast milk, formula, or blended foods. The diet can vary based on your child's medical condition and tolerance, and this goes for adults as well. I used to blend up my son's food, put it in the microwave, get it warm, and feed it through the tube. It's a little harder because it is warm and it's not just liquid, but he still had the nutrition that he needed. So with adults, you can put feeding any kind of feeding down that tube. Just blend it up. And that's another thing that people don't understand. You can feed them anything that you eat. All you had to do is blend it up. With my son, man, before I could afford the formula and before the insurance would pay for the formula, I was blending up food to feed him. And I just have to say, it's a little work. But then after the formula was approved, then we were able to get formulas and just pour it in. But I just want to let people know that feeding tubes are not bad things. Feeding tubes are nutritional uh, supplements for the patient. They're not bad things. And I didn't like the way it was so much negativity talked about feeding tubes. So, with that said, I just hope that this has been good for some people. If you have an adult or a child with special needs that requires or will require a feeding tube, just pray about it. Pray about it and just think about the benefits that it could be. I used to tell my son, I don't know anybody that could sleep and get fed at the same time. He would sleep, but we still fed him. And I just want to say that a feeding tube is not that it's not keeping a person alive artificially. It is simply giving them the nutritional supplement and foods and drinks, because you can put water down it, you can put tea, you can have them drinking whatever you drink. But I just want to say I hope this has helped someone. That's really what I wanted to do, is just help someone with the decision that they might have to make in the future about their adults, parents, or relatives that might need that feeding tube, and their children. I thank you guys for listening, and I will see you next year. Y'all have a blessed day, and remember, peace.